Hi and welcome back. So I watched a video on the streaming platform YouTube a few days ago, and it is this video on the right here from Epicurus. They're a food channel, I guess, and they're talking about two blenders. So the blenders they've got here are the Vitamix on the left and a $25 Oscar on the right, and they're, I guess, comparing price differences between the two between the two blenders. And I figured I'd go through and react to this. Also on the left here, I have my personal blender made by a company called Blendtec. And if you remember back probably about 10 years, there was a series of commercials they put out that were called Will It Blend, where they just blended all kinds of random garbage. So let's start off the old video here. So they've got an intro, some interesting stuff. So they've got this first blender test where they're doing a smoothie, and I'm gonna play my smoothie equivalent on the left here. And since they're talking about smoothie mode on the Blendtec, it has no specific smoothie mode. So instead, I just actually it does have a smoothie mode. It is the smoothie button there, and it seemed to work pretty good. So they blended up their stuff here, and let's see. They get to it. I pour my stuff in. We're all blending at the same time. I guess I gotta speed myself up here. And I just like to pause it here. So they're gonna talk about how the ingredients at the top of the container got stuck, and you'll see that my blender has no such trouble. And then they go to talk about how this tamp is, just the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I'm sure it solves the problem, but I personally think that the problem is not the tamp. The problem is some design thing in the base that stops it from actually functioning as a blender, and it requires this like handicap. So let's continue on. So the Oscar, of course, didn't come with a tamp. He uses a spatula. Um, that's all great. We pour it out. Obviously, the $600 blender ends up, with a better, I guess, smoother smoothie by a little bit. So I will skip forward here. Here's me pouring it on a plate. I would say it's pretty smooth. Couldn't feel any chunks at all when I tried this. And I will admit this recipe they've got for this thing is pretty tasty. So I would recommend this smoothie if you want to identify the ingredients. But they complain about the I guess cheap blender being too, I guess, too let's see, too mushy, not blended up enough. And they go on to talk about, how cavitation is great, and cavitation is great, and I'd say that they're probably right. Cavitation, really depends on your blade, and then, depending on the design of the blade, you're going to have some type of low pressure bubble form around the back of it. And inside of this bubble, the water is going to be so low pressure that it will actually boil at room temperature, right? So you get little boiling bubbles, and then they drift out of this, I guess, cavitation zone, and they collapse, and this causes like shock waves that go out through your, I guess, material. In this case, it would be the smoothie. And that helps break it down. You've also got these blades which help break it down, and you'll notice that on the Vitamix blades here, they're quite flat. and I'm sure that is to help with the tamp. And I guess I'll talk about that more later. So talk about cavitation. Cavitation is great, but the Oscar he thinks doesn't spin fast enough for it to happen. I think, that's probably about true-ish enough. The Oscar probably, wasn't designed with super cavitation in mind. They probably had to give up some, I guess, design considerations on the blades in order to make a blender so cheap. They probably got, stamped sheet metal blades as opposed to some type of more expensive process like bent sheet metal or maybe even milled billet. So we pour them out. They're not great. Second test, crushed ice here. So I will use my blender on the left and skip through their thing on the right. So real quick for you, both these blenders have an ice crush setting. The Blendtec blender does not have an ice crush setting. I use the high setting instead. And you can see here that the Oscar had some issues. He needed a substitute tamp, and the Vitamix, was able to grind it up. But I believe, unfortunately, they needed a tamp. So grab the old tamp here, Band-Aid over the bullet wound technique, and pushed it into the bottom. You'll see here on the Vitamix, they've got a few, I guess, ice cubes left in the bottom of it. And I'm gonna pour mine out onto this plate here, and you can see the Blendtec has no ice cubes. It required no tamp, and it is, I guess, fine enough. I mean, it's basically snow. So
just a few ice cubes. As you can
few ice cubes. They compare the two of them together. The Oscar didn't do very well. So they say that this is probably due to the container, and I mean, it's like obvious, so we'll skip that bit.
Because the vessel design doesn't allow it. Mayo ingredients.
So then we're doing mayo, and I'll say right off the bat that this test is not super great because I was unable to produce it the first time. So this is my first attempt in making this mayo. And I just eyeballed the ingredients and tried to get them as close as possible. And I was completely off. And it didn't, I guess, form mayo at all because the ingredients were not in the correct proportions. So then I later went and looked up a recipe and I redid the test. So while I'm doing my initial test, we'll go through their thing. So they use the low setting on theirs. I also use the low setting on mine. And they see that they pour out the mayo, and he actually likes the Oscar's mayo better than the Vitamix mayo. The issue is the Vitamix ended up soupy, whereas the Oscars ended up kind of more clumpy and mayo shaped, and it was more stuck together. So on my second attempt here, I blended up a recipe, and if you want to do this exact same recipe, I used 2 whole eggs, 1 teaspoon of lemon juice, 1 teaspoon of mustard. I guess I specifically used Dijon mustard, honey mustard, because I had it sitting around and it's not very good. So I didn't feel bad sacrificing it. And then I used a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, and you mix all that up together, and then you slowly pour in some oil. For the oil, I used 1 cup of vegetable oil. And you'll see here that it did form an actual mayo this time. I tasted it, It wasn't very good, but I'm also not a mayo person, so maybe there's better recipes out there. And I would say that my mayo clumped up probably about as good as the Vitamix, or about as good as the $25 Oscar blender here. It's difficult to compare because we're using two different recipes, and obviously this is a, I guess, sensitive product. It's even possible that they got their, I guess, consistencies mixed up or consistencies wrong, because they had different formulas, slightly more oil here, slightly more oil there. Maybe they were in a rush and they put some extra, I guess they poured the oil in too fast into one of them. But here's me pouring it on a plate, and you'll see that it is about the consistency of the Oscar. Pretty clumpy, not very liquidy.
I think the results were mainly driven by the shape of the container.
So they think the results are driven by the shape of the container. I think that's complete bunk because my container shape is almost the same as the Vitamix, and I got completely different results. I think the Vitamix is just like, not great, or their test is not great. So moving on to the next bits,
Finally, I'm going to be making some nut butter.
some nut butter.
Thick and dense, so this test.
So spoiler alert, the I guess cheap blender ended up dying when they made this nut butter, so let out the smoke, and they compare the two of them together, and this took forever, by the way. I would not recommend trying to make nut butter with your blender. It isn't very, I guess it's not very tasty, at least when I tasted it, and it didn't seem to be, super great. The consistency, is good. I'll let my video play. I'll probably have to skip ahead. It took me quite some time to do this whole nut butter thing. But they killed the blender on the right. The blender on the left worked fine. So then obviously the Vitamix wins. They got the vitamins. They got a stuff getting stuck at the top. It's not great here. They use the tamp again. I don't believe in the tamp, although you notice on the left here I did end up going with, I guess, a substitute tamp because it just needed some extra stuff. Now I'd like to talk about this next comment they're going to make, the interface design in quotes. So I'll play it out and then I'll talk about why this is I guess not great.
On the Oscar, we have a sprocket geometry on the lower base, but a square.
So they've got a sprocket on the bottom of the Oscar and a square on the blender base. Right, so square on the blender base, sprocket there on the blender, I guess, container itself. And the reason they think this is bad, and they mention this, causes slipping. And I mean, I'm sure I'm not the first person to put this out here, but if I have a square peg, oops, and I've got some sprocket geometry that goes around the outside of this thing, right? And it looks like this. The chance that this red thing here slips without, I guess, the green sprocket, completely deforming in a way that would be unrecoverable is basically none. So I don't know why they're saying this. It's always possible that I completely overlooked something, but I would say there's like basically no chance this thing slips. And of course, if you're wondering why they would use I guess, sprocket on one end and square on the other. Obviously, it's cost savings, but why don't they put a square on both ends? And they do the sprocket so that you can slide it down over this square, and it will self-align. And you'll notice that on the, I guess, more expensive Vitamix blender, it does a similar thing. It's just sprocketed on both sides. So if you were really putting this to this particular part to a test, I would expect the Vitamix to perform way better because it's got basically twice as much surface area, whereas the you know, the square and sprocket doesn't have as much surface area, but this is obviously not a part that fails and it's not a part that slips. So I am kind of confused as to why they would even bring this part up.
And that could damage the components.
So, and then they say it damages components. How would this damage anything? I have no clue. I'm obviously missing something.
Gear that has a perfectly
So, mating receptacle, it's all good. No chance of slippage unless it's completely broken, at which point they would both slip. So let's go ahead and move on.
For $25, it was a valiant attempt.
So they go, you know, one on the right kind of ends up sandy, one on the left is pretty good. The Blendtec, I'm actually going to skip forward a bit here. Looks like we were almost done. And I'm going to take this and smear it out onto a, let's see, a plate here. And on this plate, you're going to see it's got the consistency of like a chunky peanut butter. I'm sure I could have gotten this more, I guess, smooth if I had blended it for longer, but it looks pretty good. And I tried it and it wasn't very tasty, so I wasn't really interested in spending more time in this. And then here's a video of the sprocket. So sprocket on the container side, you notice it's got little flutes. I'm not sure what you would call them, but we'll call them flutes. And these flutes help twist the, I guess, sprocket to be in line with the sprocket on the base unit. So if you put it down and it's ever so slightly mismatched, it'll self-align, no problem. And then let's see, I believe then they go to talk about, you know, the blade design. So the blade design for the Oscar is very upright. The blade design for the Vitamix is quite flat. So both of these designs probably are okay. This is the blade design for the Blendtec. It is substantially different. This is, I don't know, probably bent sheet metal. You can tell that this is much, much, much thicker than the blades on the Oscars. So it is drastically thicker. I don't know if that says anything. It's also only got two blades, and it's got, you know, the little wing tips. So I'm not, you know, blade design analyst or anything, so I'm not sure what this means, but I thought it was interesting that this blender is substantially different in this quality from the other two blenders.
Has blades that are more or less flat.
So we'll skip ahead. Here they're using the tamp again. Of course, gotta sell the tamp.
Overall, if you're going to be making a lot of nut butters,
and pouring. They say the Oscar spout's not great. The other one, or the Oscar spout is fine, and the Vitamix is not great. I had no issues pouring out with my blender. I really like my blender. So then they go to talk about loudness, and they say that their decibels are, let's see, a decibel meter. I believe they measured about 95 and 100 for the, I guess, more expensive and cheaper blenders. I measured the, I guess, noise of my blender, and it is about 80 decibels, although it did seem to max out the decibel app that I had installed on my smartphone. So it is possible, actually, it is probable that 80 is not a correct measurement, but they're all pretty loud, and once you get up to that loud, I guess loudness level, it doesn't really matter how loud it is. It's going to be annoying, and you're above the threshold for annoying. So I don't know if loudness is actually a selling feature as long as it's super loud.
With state-of-the-art materials. The pitcher is made of Triton.
So then they go to talk about the
rigid.
pitcher being, I guess, pitcher on the Vitamix, expensive blender, being made out of a special, polymer, plastic, that is all these amazing things. You can put it in the dishwasher and all kinds of stuff. And this is it's a difficult topic to talk about because material science is quite difficult, and it would be difficult to know how this material performs without having it on hand to compare. But we do compare it to glass, and the I guess glass mixer is probably about the same. You probably you're not going to break either of them. They're both good enough. It is interesting to note that the Oscar went with a glass, I guess, bowl because glass is substantially heavier, and I would reckon that they probably chose glass as a way to compensate for the lightness of the base. If you've ever had like an expensive blender and a cheap blender next to each other, you'll notice that the expensive blender's base weighs a lot. And that's because it's got a big motor inside of it. Whereas a cheap blender will have a cheap motor inside of it. And cheap motors, I guess they could weigh a lot, but typically they're cheap because they're small. And I guess another interesting thing that I just wanted to briefly talk about is you've got your blender here. These are the blades, and it comes down, right? And then you've got some type of motor box, right? And then on the bottom of this motor box is like a fan. And this fan blows air up and out like this. And let's see. Yeah, like that. And if your blades stop, I guess, turning, then your motor stops receiving cooling. So interesting thing here is this is, I guess, one thing that could have potentially caused earlier in the video when they were blending up the nut butter. They actually ended up destroying the Oster blender. And my guess is that the nut butter probably slowed the blades down, and then it stopped receiving cooling, and then and then it overheated and it smoked. And I actually have experience with destroying blenders, and I will tell you that the blenders that I have destroyed, zero of them had any type of overheating safety shutoff. So I would reckon that when this blender let out the smoke here, that there, I guess, was no safety, and the blender is actually completely toast. So yeah, let's see. I think that's the end of the video. I hope this was interesting. This is kind of different from what we normally talk about, but I figured it'd be kind of interesting to talk about the design of these blenders. Personally, I think they're both okay. For the price points, I think that the Vitamix blender is probably way more expensive than it should be. And this tamp is a tool that it's good to have, but you shouldn't need to tamp down your juice. So your blender just doesn't have like enough suction force pulling the stuff down into the blades. So maybe this is an interesting comparison. But I will leave it there. Let me know if you have any comments in the comment section, and I hope you have a nice day.